Hola, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a esta tercera sesión de ¿En qué piensan los expertos? La tercera y última sesión de este formato en el Museo Reimaginado. La finalidad de ¿En qué piensan los expertos? Es poder profundizar más temas muy específicos que están trabajando actualmente, digamos, a manera de borrador, los invitados al encuentro. Y en esta tercera sesión nos acompaña Michael John Gorman, a quien yo realmente le agradezco mucho este tiempo para poder profundizar más en sus últimas investigaciones y sus últimos proyectos. Y voy a presentarlo brevemente. Hay más información también de él en la página del Museo Reimaginado, antes de cederle la palabra. Michael John Gorman es investigador y es profesor de la Universidad de Munich. Las líneas de investigación que trabaja son las articulaciones entre arte, ciencia, ciencias de la vida, digamos desde una visión mucho más compleja, y también en los últimos años la relación entre arte, ciencia y diseño. Tiene muchas obras publicadas y un proyecto muy interesante que seguramente muchos de ustedes conocen, que se llama Science Gallery, un proyecto de arte y ciencia que se ha desarrollado en diferentes partes del mundo, que es un antecedente, me parece, también del proyecto que hoy presenta de BIOTOPIA. Y bueno, también ha sido profesor visitante como postdoctorante en universidades como el MIT o como Harvard. Es un verdadero gusto que hoy nos hable, digamos, de en qué está pensando ahora, qué es lo que está desarrollando. Y la dinámica es que él va a hacer una presentación y al final de la presentación ustedes pueden ya comenzar con preguntas específicas que tengan sobre su práctica. Muchas gracias y comenzamos. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much. Gracias.
Claro que sí. Sí.
So, just out of interest, hello everybody, it's great to be here. Out of interest, how many people will be listening to this with the Spanish translation? How many people will listen to me in Spanish? Okay, so a few of you. So I'll try to speak a little bit slowly so there's time for the translator. So what is on the expert's mind? That's the name of this session. That's my hat. My hat goes on my head rather than in my mind, okay. But thank you, Nina. So, it's an interesting and challenging topic. Can you really reveal exactly what's on your mind at a conference? It can be published on YouTube. Can be tricky. And what is an expert? This is something which I think will come up in this discussion. Surely everybody is an expert in some way, at the very minimum, about their own personal experience. So what's on my mind is that I have just been working on a book about the future of science museums called Idea Colliders, the Future of Science Museums, which is going to come out next year, published by the MIT Press. And so I've been thinking a lot about the future of science museums, and I'm also, for the past years, have been working to create new kinds of spaces and museums for engagement with science. As was mentioned, I founded a space called Science Gallery in Dublin, which was with Trinity College in Dublin in Ireland, where I come from. And we then worked to create that as a global network of galleries. And some of you may, last time at this conference, have met Andrea Bandelli, who is now continuing that project. And I am now working in Munich on creating a new museum for life sciences and environment, which is called BIOTOPIA, which is really looking at life and how we engage with biodiversity, biology, and the environment. So that's been on my mind quite a lot. But today I don't want to talk much about Biotopia, but I want to talk about a subject which I'm finding increasingly interesting and important for museums, which is the subject of trust. So the question of who do you trust? Do you trust museums? How can museums cultivate trust in visitors and in audiences? And this is something which I think is an important question for our field, and particularly, I think, for people in working in science museums, but not only for science museums. But I would just be interested, before we really dig in asking, are any of you working or involved with museums that are more science museums? Maybe put your hands up if you're, yeah? And anybody working in art museums? Okay, so definitely more art museums. And what about history museums or other kinds of museums, heritage museums? Yeah, okay, so that's a good mix. So I think we'll have some good discussions between us on how trust works in these different kinds of museums. So I would like you to do a little exercise with me. So I would like you to turn to your neighbor and tell a story or discuss one example of how trust has been important in your work and in your institution. So it could be a story about a time when somebody trusted you and took a leap of faith in you, or a time when somebody distrusted you and you had to overcome distrust. So maybe I'm going to give you 2 minutes, but make sure there's time for each of you to tell an example. So 1 minute each. So please turn to your neighbor and now discuss one of these examples. So 2 minutes. One more minute. Okay, stop. So there were lots of lively conversations going on. Is anyone brave enough to share one of the stories with the room? Anyone who would be willing to share a story with the room? Yeah? Oh, we have somebody here, I believe. Either Inglés o Español.
¿Está activo? Sí. Hola. Soy William de Houston, Texas. ¿Voy a decir en español? ¿Tenías la oportunidad? Oh.
I'm just going to get my...
Okay. Ready?
Yeah, go.
En aquel tiempo trabajaba para un museo de ciencias y tuvimos la oportunidad de llevar una exhibición con restos de seres humanos. Era una exhibición sobre salud pública y las consecuencias de mala dieta, de fumar y otras cosas, ¿no?, al ser humano. Entonces fue como una exhibición de mejorar la vida, pero fue controversial porque fueron restos actuales de seres humanos que fueron conservados. Y tuvimos una conversación con nuestro cuerpo directivo del museo, de la póliza de eso, y qué fueron las consecuencias. Y al final llegamos de acuerdo y tuvimos también a unos expertos de póliza y llegaron de acuerdo con nosotros, con el cuerpo directivo, que era para el bien de la comunidad que valía la pena hacer la exhibición. Entonces el cuerpo directivo tuvo que confiar en nosotros que no íbamos a poner mal al museo, no íbamos a causar daño a la reputación del brand del museo.
Great, thank you. Is there anybody else who had one example? Thank you very much. Yes? One more here. We have time for just one more, yeah?
Bueno, yo quiero hablar de el trabajo de crear confianza, ¿lo dices tú, no? Confianza, que confíen en ti, porque al ser el Museo Frida Kahlo y Anahuacalli, al ser museos no gubernamentales y que no tenemos dinero del gobierno ni de un trustee, sino que tenemos que salir a pedir confianza de la gente y de una empresa a que nos dé dinero. Recientemente en México hubo un escándalo que lo hicieron a propósito político, pero también el origen era, no sé, un conflicto con Carolina Herrera, que dijeron que se había fusilado y de ahí se agarraron las banderas del populismo para decir fuera de México y que nos respeten. En parte tiene razón, en parte no, lo politizaron, se debió haber tomado, no sé, cada quien. Pero entonces, que los diseñadores a nivel mundial no quieren hacer cosas en México porque están muy espantados. Y llegó entonces a Jean-Paul Gaultier, que quiere mucho a México, y que había estado en la lucha libre, y que adora a Frida, y que ha hecho conciertos, los vestidos de Madonna, en homenaje a Frida, los hizo Jean-Paul, y quería hacer una ofrenda a su abuela, con el oso de peluche de él cuando tenía 6 años. Y no querían porque tenían desconfianza, me fueron a ver y les dije, confíen en México, ustedes están haciendo algo muy respetuoso, un homenaje que nadie ha hecho a la cultura popular, que la puso a nivel mundial, y la firma y él nos dieron mucho dinero. Tenemos más de 45,000 personas hasta hoy día, esperamos cerrar con 60,000, pero ellos confiaron y la gente confió y los periodistas confiaron. Y les dije, vamos, nada más eso, si sigan, porque hay que entrar en la sutileza y en la confianza. Y de veras, o sea, siento que hay que labrar esa confianza, decirles que pueden confiar en nosotros estudiar muy bien los temas y confiar en ellos, y el resultado, pues ahí está.
Thank you very much. So I think you've probably experienced from these examples and from your own discussions that trust permeates every aspect of our lives. It's something that's vital. You could not come to this building this morning without trusting people, trusting maybe the bus driver that he's going to take you to the right location, and many other people along the way. So Confucius actually wrote to his disciple Tzu Kung. He said he advised him to abandon weapons first, then food, but never abandon trust. People cannot get on without trust. Trust is more important than life. So that was what Confucius said. And I'm interested in the question of trust in museums. And this is really something that where I don't have the answers. I have some questions and some ideas which I would like to share with you and discuss with you today. And I think it's great that we have a good mixture of types of museums in the audience, but probably I will speak a little bit more about science museums because that is the world that I know better. So why is trust important today? Well, I think one reason it's important is because we are right now living in an age of weaponized lies. We are surrounded by lies. Lies have been around a long time, but there's something different going on now. So back in 2011, someone called Eli Pariser wrote a wonderful book called The Filter Bubble, and he coined this expression, the filter bubble. This idea that through new technology, people will become more and more isolated. In fact, the idea that the technologies which were created to connect us are actually going to divide us. So it was actually quite a forward-thinking thing to think of back in 2011. And what we've seen, particularly in the last 3 years, has completely confirmed this idea. So the internet has weaponized lies, and particularly everyone knows about what happened with, for example, Cambridge Analytica and the manipulation of targeted Facebook advertising to deceive people, but in elections in the US, and also what happened in the UK around the Brexit campaign, and also many other elections, particularly of populist leaders around the world. So we are living in a very challenging time in terms of who do you trust? Who can you trust? Can you believe what you read? And people are very confused. And I believe that museums have a key role to play in this crisis of trust. So in the world of science, there's nothing new about this idea of fake news. So even back many years ago, when the first evidence began to appear about a link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer, big tobacco companies sponsored people to come out with contrary stories to challenge the science and to create a sense that the science was uncertain. And this was copied then later when the discussions about climate change emerged, and the oil lobbies worked very hard to create contrary stories to create a sense of confusion about the science, and that's something that we're still experiencing today. But the difference now is the speed and the targeting of misinformation that we're experiencing. So manipulation has existed for a long time with the traditional media, but the tools and techniques are very different now. And this filter bubble effect and these echo chambers are leading to what has been described by Robert Putnam as this social fragmentation and the breakdown of social institutions in his book, Bowling Alone, a classic work. So what is the solution to this? It's difficult. In the world of science, one interesting example was when people went out on the March for Science. Has anyone heard of the March for Science? Yeah. So the March for Science was well motivated, but presented a challenging vision of science, which I find difficult, because the March for Science presented the idea that science is the facts. Science is certainty. Science is what is known. And this is something that we know is an inaccurate way to represent science. Science is a process. Science is about exploring the unknown. It's a highly social process, and that's what's wonderful about science. It's a dynamic way of exploring evidence. And unfortunately, many people from their schooling have the memory of science being the answers in the back of the book, and science as a massive truth. But that's actually a very distorted way to present science. And I think things like the March for Science have suffered from this idea that we should, to counteract fake news and fake science, we need to say that no, science is certain, it's all true, we know the facts. And that's a very vulnerable position, because science is constantly being corrected and being developed. There's an Australian professor who's called Clive Hamilton, and he's even developed a whole theory called strategic essentialism. And this theory says that actually we should really present a noble lie about science, because the public don't really understand science, so let's just say it's all true. Let's say it's certain, and that way they'll believe us. But this has been much criticized as an approach by people such as Bruno Latour, the sociologist of science, who used to be someone who was associated with being a critic of science, but he now feels that his key role is actually to restore trust in science, but not science as a body of facts, but science as a process. Science as a process of exploration and discovery. This is an interesting approach where I believe that museums can contribute. But before we come to museums, I would just like to ask a very basic question. What is trust? And what causes trust? And the great thing about this is that people from so many different disciplines have explored trust, from sociologists to philosophers to economists, and even to neuroscientists and neurobiologists. So there was a very popular theory a couple of years ago where suddenly everybody thought that the hormone oxytocin was the trust hormone, and there was scientific papers published about it, and salespeople started dousing themselves in this hormone and spraying themselves before they would try to go into a meeting with someone, or fundraisers also, believing that this would convince somebody to part with money. And I tried it, actually it doesn't work. But actually the science has been called into question recently, so it's not quite as straightforward, in the wonderful way of science constantly correcting itself. So that's the neurobiology, but there's a wonderful book published this year by a person called Rachel Botsman called Who Can You Trust? And Rachel Botsman, she boils it down to 4 key ingredients that are characteristic of trust in terms of you deciding which person you should trust. So the first one is competency. Competency, that means your expertise, your knowledge of the matter. So is this person somebody who knows anything about this topic or not, you know? Or institution. The second one is not quite the same, it's reliability. So somebody can be incredibly competent, but utterly unreliable. They don't show up to the meeting, they forget things, and they're just not a very reliable person. And it turns out that really matters if we decide who to trust. You know, so those 2 things, competency and reliability. They can also be extremely reliable and completely incompetent. The third is empathy. So empathy turns out to be very important for trust. In this context, what does empathy mean? It means that I feel that you genuinely care about me. If I don't think you care about me, I'm going to be very slow to trust you. I need to think that you actually care about me in this exchange. And the fourth one is integrity. So integrity meaning that there is an alignment between your words and deeds, and you and I share goals. So these 4 are very important concepts. So now, in relation to science has traditionally scored quite well on competency, and also pretty well on reliability. But it hasn't done so well on the other 2. It hasn't done so well on empathy. Science communication often has not involved a huge amount of empathy. And it has also sometimes not done well in relation to integrity. People are often skeptical when they feel that, for example, scientists working on genetically modified organisms might be funded by Monsanto, or they might be skeptical that scientists necessarily have their best interests at heart. And this has caused a certain distrust of science. So this is important, I think, as we think about museums and trust. You know, how can we exhibit competency, reliability, empathy, and integrity in our work? And integrity in this context really amounts to authenticity. So according to Rachel Botsman, right now we're experiencing a really dramatic shift in trust. So historically, until the beginning of modernity, trust was local. So trust resided in small communities. It was a face-to-face experience. It was about personal relationships at a very local level. Some of you might have heard of this idea of the Dunbar number of, you know, each person can have a maximum of 150 people that they know closely. So trust in the era of local trust was restricted to that close circle. Then we had trust in institutions. This was the second shift. So when we had large institutions emerging, the church, government, banks, educational institutions, universities. So institutional trust gradually displaced local trust as people needed to be able to trust in strangers, beginning with the very first trade routes and then continuing until the 20th century. But right now, trust in institutions is plummeting. So we're living in a moment when trust in institutions is going down. Trust in government, trust in in media, trust in even in non-NGOs is generally on the decline. According to Botsman, there's a new era emerging of distributed trust. So what is distributed trust? Well, she thinks that distributed trust is, for example, the fact that I will allow someone to stay in my apartment who I've never met before. So, for example, Airbnb, all of these technologies, Uber, also, for example, Bitcoin, digital currencies are an example of this distributed trust. So where the institutional trust is generally vertical and hierarchical and driven by authority, distributed trust is more horizontal, it's more shared, and it's facilitated often by technology. But one has to admit that technology's role in facilitating trust is at best ambiguous. I enjoy getting restaurant ratings when I'm in Oaxaca through technology. I'm often happy to stay in Airbnb apartments, but I don't think I would enjoy being part of the social credit system. The social credit system, which is being rolled out next year in China. I don't know if you've heard about this. So every single individual in China will have a score for trustworthiness. And this is being implemented in 2020. It's enabled by face recognition and by public surveillance systems. And your score, your trust score, effectively, is going to affect everything from your ability to get a job or for the ability for your children to attend a particular school, to even the speed of your internet connection. All of these things will depend on your trust score, which, for example, if you cross a pedestrian crossing illegally or something like this, your trust score could go down a little bit. So this is a situation where technology is certainly creating a system of trust, but I'm not sure if that is actually creating trust or in fact removing the need for trust. So how does all this relate to museums? Well, so there was a survey that was done in 2018, and it turned out that in an age of plummeting institutional trust, museums are absolute outliers, where trust is dropping in governments, trust is dropping in all of the classical institutions, the media, even in science institutions. On the other hand, the museums are scoring about 79% of people are saying that they believe that museums are highly credible institutions. And so there's been some really fascinating research on this done by Impacts Research, and Colleen Dillenschneider is one of the key people involved. And she has said this wonderful expression. She says, museums have the superpower of trust. So, and as everyone who watches Spider-Man knows, with great power comes great responsibility. So how do we use this superpower wisely? You know, given that we are such trusted institutions. So I think there's an easy way and a more interesting way. So the easy way would be for us to fall back on the classical institutional trust model based on authority. So museums are places of authority that inform us about the world, and you know, there are places where we can go to receive the answers. But given the way the trust shift is moving, that seems like probably a retrograde approach right now. And it's also highly vulnerable, because it seems that people come less and less into museums for the purposes of finding information. There are other ways to get the information. A museum is not necessarily the first place that you go, particularly in an age where young women living in the slums of Delhi have access to a smartphone. So this is probably not the right strategy for museums. Although it's a valid strategy, the idea that we are the experts, we know everything, come to us and learn the facts. So what other approaches could be possible? Well, to explore this, I would like to talk about a little bit about the idea of social capital. Who's heard of social capital? Pretty much about half of you. Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, talked about different kinds of capital. So there's the classic economic capital, which is what you have in terms of property and things that can be translated into money. Then there is cultural capital. Cultural capital you can describe as what you know. So cultural capital includes your educational level and everything that you know. And then there is social capital. So social capital could be described as who you know, the social networks that you're able to mobilize. Museums and similar institutions for a long time have been absolute exemplars of transmitters of cultural capital. And I think we're moving into an age where museums need to think of themselves more as places to transmit social capital. And why is this? Well, I think, as I've said, thinking of the museum as a place to transmit cultural capital, apart from the fact that information is ubiquitous in the world that we live in now, is also problematic because the stories told by science museums and the objects that they display can often be exclusional to significant sections of the population. So there's a very interesting book by Emily Dawson called Equity, Exclusion, and Everyday Science Learning, where she looks at populations who feel excluded, particularly from science museums. So I would like to suggest that we really need to focus on the opportunities for museums to be transmitters of social capital in order to build trust and to burst the filter bubble. I'll give you a personal story of my own experience in this regard. So when I was 17 years old, I wanted to be a musician. And I was living in Germany, and I was playing music in the streets to make money to support my budding career as a clarinetist. On that trip, I toured around Germany, and I went to Munich, where I'm now living, and I went to visit the famous Deutsches Museum, which is one of the great museums of science and technology. And I went in there, and it was incredibly impressive. I saw these amazing models of mines and incredible turbines and engineering devices. And I went out of the museum, and nobody talked to me in that whole time that I was in this museum. I had no social connection. And it was interesting because I was right at that moment when I was trying to figure out really what to do with my life and if really the clarinet was the future for me. And then a couple of months later, I returned to Ireland, where I come from, to Dublin. And I met a physics professor. And in 15 minutes, I heard from this physics professor about Schrodinger's cat and the theory of relativity and all of these things, these weird and wonderful things that I'd never learned about in school. And immediately I decided I want to do this. I want to study physics. And then I applied to Oxford and I went to study physics in Oxford. And it was all the result of that 15-minute conversation. And clearly this is a story of privilege. I was very fortunate to be in a social network where I could have a chance to meet somebody like that and have that conversation. But this was an experience which I reflected on many years later when I was working to create Science Gallery in Dublin as a place for creative collisions between science and art. Because it really convinced me of the power of conversation. And I thought, how can I make that experience that I had more available to more people? You know, what could we do to help with that as we create this new museum? So we did many things. So we decided this was going to be a core part of what we did in Science Gallery, to be a place for conversation across boundaries. And we had student mediators who were science students and who were, every visitor who went to the gallery, we wanted them to have a conversation with one of those enthusiastic science students. And the amazing thing when we did visitor research was, of all of whatever exhibition we had on, it didn't matter. The number one thing people enjoyed was the conversation. So sometimes I thought, oh God, we could have wallpaper on the walls here and it wouldn't matter, just have the mediator. So that was a really important experience for people. We also created context where we had researchers who would come in and have the public participate in research experiments, experiencing science in the making. And this was interesting because some of the scientists had to step outside their comfort zone. So I don't know if many of you have worked with scientists, but there is sometimes a tendency, when scientists are among themselves, they talk very openly about everything that's going wrong with their experiments and things that they don't know and things that they're trying to figure out and things that are not working. But often once they step into a public arena, they default to this sort of authority communication where they use phrases like, we now know that X, Y, and Z. And sometimes it's hard to get them into the space of being open and vulnerable about what they don't know. But we found that if you could get scientists into that context, for example, we had an exhibition called Infectious when the Mexican flu epidemic was happening, the swine flu, and as soon as this broke out, we called in the scientists and we had the media, and nobody knew what was going on. And the public were fascinated because the scientists were saying, well, it could be this, but we don't know, and it might spread like this. And suddenly it was captivating because people were admitting what they didn't know, and suddenly they were really connecting with what the scientists were actually trying to figure out. So in a way, that trust leap is a very important one, to be able to trust the public and to trust people, to be able to accept the fact that scientists do not have all of the answers. And this was a very important aspect of work, to have this vulnerable perspective. In thinking about what we do as institutions, there's a real risk, even if we work hard to create social capital and to have these kinds of experiences in our museums, as well as the encounters with objects that are so important. And often the objects and the conversations go very well together. But there's a real risk of replicating the social systems that already exist. Putnam has this really interesting way of talking about this. So he talks about the difference between bonding social capital and bridging social capital. So bonding social capital brings together people who have common interests and a common worldview. And bridging social capital is a way of connecting people with radically different perspectives and interests. And it turns out that bonding social capital is not always a very good thing. So if you think of ISIS or the Ku Klux Klan, those are extreme examples of bonding social capital. So I think rather than just focusing on social capital, our institutions need to focus on being places to create the bridging social capital. How can we step outside the circle? How can we invite people in who are not necessarily from the same perspective? And I think it's not easy, and I would be fascinated to learn about your experiments in doing this. And this is something that is very important to us as we now work to develop BIOTOPIA in Munich. So we have a very particular context for this. We're building a new museum about environment and life sciences, looking at these key themes such as biodiversity and climate change. And right now, people are in the streets about biodiversity. They're in the streets about climate change. Young people are very exercised and energized about these topics. So the interesting question for us is, how can we create an institution which these people will trust, not necessarily as an authority, but maybe as a broker, as somewhere that will connect them in with interesting scientists, interesting people from different perspectives around these key topics of our time. And we know that there's the hunger, the interest, so how can we not make the mistake of becoming the patronizing, authoritative museum? And I think this is something which was very important. We have access to incredible scientists like the Max Planck Society, the two main universities in Munich, but we need to draw them into a different kind of engagement where they are listening as much as speaking with the public. So becoming not the expert, but the broker. I believe that's key. So just to end, I'd like to say, I think if we wish to have any hope of piercing the filter bubble and really harnessing this precious resource, the trust of our communities, and also addressing the current rise of populism and anti-science views, and to offer marginalized groups opportunities to engage with and contribute to science. I think we need to reframe the purpose of science museums and science centers as connectors and brokers, and as providers of bridging social capital rather than as transmitters of cultural capital. And this will require a radical shift in the way we design and run our institutions. And we need to shift away from thinking inside the walls of these iconic Starchitect design buildings towards a more networked, rhizome-like social vision of the museum. So be vulnerable, open up the process, invite people in. One of the things that we're doing as we are creating BIOTOPIA is we are framing things as experiments. If you say that something is an experiment, it's a great opportunity for the public to actually be part of the experiment, rather than thinking this is something where we know everything and we're going to share the information with you. So there are all sorts of techniques, and I would love to hear what you are doing in this regard. But I think if we do this and if we're courageous, we can move not from the institutional authoritative model to a techno-utopian model of trust, but in a way we can rediscover the power of local, embodied, personal interactions. Thank you. And if do we have time for some questions? 3 minutos. So I spoke too much, sorry. I would love to have any questions or comments, or also interesting examples from your own organizations. We have 3 minutes left. Yes, there's somebody at the back. Please wait for the microphone if you wouldn't mind. And maybe introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Hello, my name is Sarah Yunan. I work at the National Museum of Wales, and I work in engagement, youth engagement in particular. So I have one example where we invited the school groups that are going on protest and other young people into the museum, and we collected recycled materials and gave them the opportunity to create posters for their protests.
Fantastic.
And our museum staff engaged in that process, also made posters, and so we created a space for informal conversations to start happening.
Fantastic example. How did you encounter any challenges in doing that, or what would you recommend to other museums who want to do that?
Well, in order to invite the young people in, we had to meet them, we had to tell them who we are, because there could sometimes be a level of distrust. Maybe they feel like we want to take advantage of them and their protests, so we had to establish a personal relationship and show a face in order to make that happen.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions or comments or ideas? Yes, there's one here. Just maybe wait for the microphone.
Gracias. Bueno,
Momentito.
muy bien. Bueno, yo soy divulgador de ciencia y en mi ciudad, en San Luis Potosí, en el norte de México, nosotros trabajamos con una red de divulgación de ciencia en el estado, y normalmente hacia el norte hay una como característica de, con el tema de los horóscopos y las constelaciones y todo el tema pseudocientífico. Así que nosotros un día en una de las plazas públicas más grandes de la ciudad decidimos jugar a leerle las cartas y hacer horóscopos gratis a las personas, y entonces pues la gente llegaba muy emocionada y se sentaba y podía como interactuar con nosotros, y nosotros fingíamos ser uno de estos pseudocientíficos, y al final era muy curioso porque pues nos basábamos en un estudio psicológico sobre cómo funciona la mente para que todo lo que te están diciendo pues tú digas sí es mío, ¿no? Es de verdad. Y les explicábamos también cómo de las constelaciones de los horóscopos precisamente, o de las constelaciones del zodiaco, pues en realidad eran 13 y no 12, y explicábamos cómo había sido este afianzamiento entre Occidente y Oriente para que coincidieran con el calendario gregoriano, y la gente pues se reía, ni siquiera se enojaba, era de que ay, no puede ser, toda mi vida viví engañada, nunca fui Virgo, era Ofiuco, entonces ¿cómo es posible?
No, I think that's beautiful, and it makes a very good point that sometimes our goals as museums may not be to make people believe, but actually to make them disbelieve, to make them challenge things and to be skeptical and to help them to develop their critical apparatus and to challenge information they receive. So it's a great example. Thank you. I love it. Oh, that's it. Show everybody that sign. It's like, I'm getting this. Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.